Welcome to another episode of the Peaceful Political Revolution in America podcast. I want to begin today with a passage that has been haunting me for some time. It comes from the Swiss scholar Pascal Lottaz, host of the Neutrality Studies podcast, in his March 2026 introduction to an interview with the political scientist Aaron Good. Lottaz opened that conversation this way. Quote, "Crime in the United States is not a bug, it's a feature. That actually explains a lot also about its illegal foreign policies. The U.S. as a political entity is deeply intertwined with crime syndicates and explicitly illegal acts under international and local law. Epstein was not at all an exception. These shady dealers are part and parcel of how U.S. politics work." Good's argument in brief is this. After the Second World War, the United States built what he calls a tripartite state. The public democratic state we learn about in civics class, the national security state of the Pentagon and of the intelligence agencies, and behind both of them, a deep state that he defines as an obscured, dominant, supranational source of antidemocratic power. That deep state, he argues, did not emerge from any constitutional design. It emerged from the pursuit of empire, from the postwar project that required, in his words, an endless exception to the rule of law in order to function. That's quite a diagnosis, and it's a powerful one, but it leaves an obvious question hanging. If the rot is systemic, what can we do about it? That question is what brings me to today's guest. Dr. Camila Vergara is a senior lecturer and director of research and innovation at the Essex Business School at the University of Essex. She is the editor of Theoria, a journal of social and political theory, and the author of Systemic Corruption: Constitutional Ideas for an Anti-Oligarchic Republic, where Aaron Good gives us a forensic account of how the American state has been hollowed out by elite criminality. Camila Vergara takes a longer view, drawing on Machiavelli, Rosa Luxemburg, and Hannah Arendt. She argues that the corruption we are describing is not a recent betrayal of an otherwise sound design. Republics, she contends, decay into oligarchies. They always have. And the question is not whether the United States is corrupt, but whether the constitutional architecture we inherited contains the tools to push back against that decay, or whether we need to build new ones. Her answer, of course, is the latter. She proposes what she calls plebeian institutions, a network of local assemblies independent of parties and government, designed to give ordinary people a permanent structural check on the power of the few. Today, we are going to talk through that argument. We will talk about how she defines systemic corruption, why she thinks reform from within is unlikely to be enough, what plebeian power could actually look like in 21st century America, and whether the U.S. Constitution, as it stands, is part of the cure or part of the disease. Dr. Camila Vergara, it's a pleasure to have you on the Peaceful Political Revolution in America podcast. Welcome to the conversation.
Thank you for having me first in this timely podcast that basically is what we need to be listening to in this time of crisis. So thank you for that.
Thank you. It's a great book, and it'd be interesting to know how this book started for you.
So the book is actually my PhD dissertation, but this was not like an intellectual endeavor only. It was born from the kind of deep understanding that all of the constitutional democracies around the world are faulty. They all look the same despite the variations. There are, national variations. And this started from the kind of the knowing that in my own country, I am from Chile, where, as you may know, there was a dictatorship led by Pinochet, who was funded by the CIA in order to topple the previous government that was a government that was socialist in nature. And Chile, from kind of a socialist project, became a neoliberal model for the world. And in my country, we have the constitution that the dictator himself drafted and is still in force today. So part of my kind of study of the law and the constitution is based on this idea that a constitution can look very liberal in a way and have the typical features of a liberal constitution, but on the ground it is enforced and it actually is a model for domination and for exploitation that has been legalized. So this understanding of my own country allowed for me to be critical with the rest of the constitutional world and understand that all constitutions are in a way faulty and they need repair, immediate, urgent repair, but not to make it better, but actually to change the system itself into a more democratic one, because it is not really democratic from its origins, as in Chile was a dictatorship, in the US was a counter-revolution, what created the Constitution, and in many places around the world are really the elites who write the Constitution and impose those laws on the people.
We don't get that in the United States. Our Constitution was a counter-revolution. Thomas Paine left the United States. He was kind of fed up with it. He just didn't think it was, he liked the way it was made. He thought the convention model was the way to approach this, but the result was highly undemocratic to him. So he was pretty disappointed with what we created in 1787.
Yes, of course. As in the book, as I show in the book, I try to look at the intellectual history of how the principles that were used during the convention and to create the rule of law had very long legs in history. And these legs were not really democratic. They were aristocratic in nature. So what I have to kind of trace in the book and try to do with all the kind of analysis of law, I do law from a material critical perspective. So from where the law emerges and how it is applied, the effects that it has in society, and not just the word of the law that could, look very, very nice and all about liberty and democracy. But at the end is how do you operationalize that law and how do you impose it and how it is suffered by the people, if you will, what counts for me. And that kind of relation with society and with the kind of socioeconomic reality is not detached from the way that the Constitution came about. So the Constitution came about as a response to the Shays Rebellion and other rebellions of veterans, basically, who, after the War of Independence, and who were farmers, yeoman farmers, owners of their own land, they were also soldiers. They went back to their lands, and their lands were spoiled. They didn't have, many resources to invest in their own fields, to basically reconstruct, their businesses. And they had to get in debt with the commercial elite. And then a couple of, years of bad weather or drought and problems, they were in debt with the elites. They would lose their farms. And not only that, they will go into prison, because at that point, if you owned money, you would go and get in prison for a few years. So we had the veterans who had liberated basically the country from the British actually being put in prison and being deprived of active citizenship because they were losing their land. And at that point, land and active citizenship were together. So you immediately were disenfranchised just for basically fighting the war for your country. So these veterans got together, and after petitioning and doing all the things that citizens do to basically seek redress, they didn't find any. They couldn't. They were asking for a abolition of debt, for having more years to pay, for having some wiggle room, basically to get on their feet. And they get no response. So what they did, they took over the courthouses, burn all the records of the debt, and basically rebel. And the convention was a response to this very alarming process in which the people themselves were asking for redress regarding property and wealth. And this was a direct attack to the elites of planters and moneylenders and lawyers who basically had and commercial elite in general, who had done very well in this moments of crisis, investing and getting returns at the detriment, basically, of the agricultural sectors of the country. So basically, the Constitution, and we see from the people that were present in that conversation and were arguing about the principles that should undergird the state, the idea was that the Constitution or the state had as principal objective to protect private property, not to give liberty or prosperity to the people, but actually to protect property from this group of people that were trying to basically undermine the natural right to property. And of course, the framers were having all this discussion based on the English intellectuals like John Locke in the 17th century, who were part of the imperial business in a way. And for them, the right to property was natural. And therefore, we needed to think about the democracy as a democracy of property owners. And whoever didn't own property was not really part of that democratic project. So in a way, there was a consensus, I would say, of the elites at that time in the US that it was crucial to defend private property from democratic demands. And the Constitution was created, its archetype, its model was based on this consensus of protecting private property. And today we know that after all these years, this actually has been the case. And today we have a level of inequality, of wealth inequality, that is even beyond the level of inequality that we had during the French Revolution.
Yeah, if you look at historical trends, inequality was fairly restrained prior to 1787, although there was that aristocratic class in the United States. After the Constitution was ratified, inequality began to skyrocket. And even after the Civil War, you could have the beginnings of a Gilded Age just 10 years after the Civil War was ended. It's remarkable that the system continued to protect this idea that property was supreme.
Yes, and this is not only in the United States. We're talking about the United States here in this podcast, but basically this is the base of all constitutions around the world. The majority of them are really neoliberal. Chile's constitution is the most neoliberal today on the books. But all of the constitutions that are based on this liberal principle and that have the right to property as a human right, even connected to the right to life, this is something that basically creates a structure of law that allows for the accumulation of property, because the more property you have, the easiest it is to get more of that. And because there's so much to go around, that property basically trickles up. This wealth trickles up. It is the dispossession of the masses that allow for the accumulation of wealth at the top. And the rule of law allows for this accumulation to be almost risk-free, because contracts need to be protected. And then the courts are there to enable that protection and secure that protection of the laws that are in the books, which are there to protect private property.
Denmark, I believe, is one of the least corrupt countries in the world, but there's nothing in their constitution that specifically prevents corruption from happening, as I understand it. It has more to do with the norms and the values in the country.
Well, I think the elite capture of government, which was what you have been saying about this kind of criminal enterprise, is what I call oligarchic democracies. So a democracy that functions, there is free and fair elections so far as we can have them, right? We have all kinds of issues with freedom of speech, but generally, free and fair. We have separation of powers. We have a working judiciary. All these things basically are there and have not been undermined. However, corruption is rampant in a way. And one of the things that the book explores is that corruption is already a loaded word that we have basically transformed and reduced to only individual corruption. So in the book, I highlight 3 types of corruption. First, the individual corruption, which is basically the quid pro quo, the official that gets money on the side, or, from procurements, the classical or nepotism, right? Fraud, all this classical criminal activities, which basically will end up with someone in prison. At least that's what we want, right? The bad apple will be imprisoned and then the rest of the system will go clean. Then there's the second type of corruption, which is institutional corruption, which is basically when systems within the larger, social systems or industries or institutions really work for a different objective than the one that they should. For example, the healthcare industry in the United States, the system as it has been created and reformed is not really a system to allow for people to be more healthy, right? Or to basically socialize the risks of being unhealthy. But actually is about enriching the insurance business and basically making money for pharmaceuticals, for the insurance companies, for hospitals, but not really centered on the health of the population. So it is really for making money for a few instead of creating a welfare and health for everyone. So therefore, you can say that that system of healthcare is systemically corrupt or institutional corrupt. And then we have the structural corruption, the systemic one, which is basically the Constitution itself. The way that we thought our systems were drawn, for example, in terms of democracy, that they were democracies, but they actually work not for the benefit of the majority, for the demos, for the people, but actually work for enriching the few that are already rich and powerful. So the rules that are created through our representative institutions by those representatives that are supposedly going to legislate in our favor, they legislate to protect the interest of the powerful few instead of serving the many. So we think that basically this kind of a constitution is really an oligarchy. The rule by the few for the benefit of the few, but just with authorization from below, us just voting for them. And this is something that is replicated everywhere, as I said, and Denmark is not an exception. However, when a constitution comes into place, when it's basically the norms are written down, if there are superimposed into a context that has history, that has values, that has already a distribution of property. So when you have a more egalitarian culture and a distribution of wealth that is not so unequal, then even if you have a liberal constitution that does not have any safeguards for, inequality not to grow, which has been growing ever since, in a way, Denmark is one of the least unequal countries in the world, but the inequality is growing, okay? So that allows for, that kind of context to delay the corruption. If you have a scenario in which you have total freedom of enterprise, which is not really a good thing, that you really make lots of money and charge immense amounts of money to almost ripping people off in a way to make your fortune in a way. If you have those kind of laissez-faire rules, then you allow for rapid accumulation of wealth. You can change your wealth in one generation. If that happens, you have a system that creates and enables inequality and therefore oppression and precarity. Not only wealth at the top, but actually domination and exploitation at the bottom.
We have some interesting values in the United States, the American exceptionalism, rugged individualism, the frontiersmen and, pulling up your bootstrap, all this self-reliance kind of stuff, and the primacy of individuality, the me kind of society, not the we society.
It is correct, and it's correct historically, and in terms of the foundations of the thinkers that were the inspiration for the framers in the United States. So that kind of individualism that you're talking about is born in the United Kingdom, basically, with John Locke and others, who are the fathers of liberalism, of the idea that the individual is the basic unity of society. While you cannot really be an individual and flourish as an individual if you're by yourself. You can only be an individual in society. So the Aristotelian, wisdom that you can only be a human if you are in society, that only beasts and gods live outside of society. So therefore, the society is prior to the individual, right? There's no individuality without society. That, and of course, the idea of the common good, the idea that economics or making money out of just money lending was just terrible, was something that it shouldn't be pursued, was, anathema for the Greeks, at least for the Greeks that were more sophisticated. That kind of thinking that also was present during the Middle Ages is completely undermined during the modernity period, and the individual comes in as the bearer of all rights, and this idea of almost the superhuman, that you can really conquer everything, and your relationship with nature changes in a way from living in an ecosystem that you are in touch with whatever is around you, and you need to keep the balance, to a very extractive, rentierist, the end justify the means kind of mentality that it basically allows for the destruction of ecosystems and for the dispossession of the majority of people that lived off the land towards accumulation of wealth by wealthy barons, and for these same people to become, wage laborers and part of the Industrial Revolution. And then we know what all this kind of evolution has brought us, this progress has brought us to the brink of ecocide in a way, and destruction. So I think there is really connected to this kind of long history of kind of a British identity also as the individual, as the center, that then passes to the United States through this very knowledgeable framers, and that is reproduced, codified in law, reproduced, and the whole culture is basically developed around that individualism that does not allow for any limits to the accumulation of property. If you think about it, the only thing that does not have limits in the United States is the accumulation of property. You can accumulate and accumulate ad infinitum without any limit to it. Everything else has a limit, but the accumulation of wealth. So therefore, it is a system that is an oligarchy in a way. It is the one, a society that is moved by the desire to possess and oppress.
We came to North America looking for religious freedom, right? And then we immediately began a genocide and exterminated tens of millions of indigenous people, imported hundreds of thousands of slaves into the country who had no rights whatsoever. Yet we pride ourselves somehow on being a country based on freedom. But our origins are rather different than that. I guess you could say we got off on the wrong foot.
It is not. This is a very, interesting question and comment in the sense that, I don't think the U.S. got off the wrong foot. It's just, the freedom that was created or carved out for, the white entrepreneur, immigrant who came to this country, was based upon the usurpation of land, the enclosure of the commons, the same as it happened in England, in which the wealthy feudal lords were enclosing common forests and putting just fences around it and claiming them as theirs, depriving the people from the rights to access those spaces in which they can, get their animals to eat grass and get timber. All these things are essential for life at that time. In the US, it was the same thing. The enclosure of the lands of indigenous peoples for the benefit of the, entrepreneur. This is connected, right? It's not that you can have freedom for all. It's never like a win-win situation when you have like this windfalls, right? And if you're not taking from the indigenous peoples, you're taking from the earth. That happens with, gold or oil. It is kind of this extractive mentality of making wealth out of almost nothing very easily and fast. But I think would be wrong to think about the United States as only, a place in which this relation took place, in the sense that it's always about, the freedom of some against the domination of many, in a way. But actually, there is a creativity and a freedom to explore in very different ways that you don't have in other countries. There is a mentality of creativity and a kind of embrace of creativity that you don't see in other places, which are more conservative or more traditionally bound. So in a way, there's two sides of the same coin. You can have freedom for some, and that freedom will allow for exponential freedom to explore and to create, and on the other, for the domination of many. And that could never be separated in a way. And the challenge is, how can we really separate it and really decouple freedom from domination?
Americans are known for their ingenuity, as you suggest, but we're not very creative when it comes to our political system.
So I would say that the first thing is a general approach to higher law. In every country in the world, the idea of the basic law or the constitution is something that is really over the head of everyone. First of all, it's almost like sacred text. And then you have these jurists who are trained for many years to decode the text and to interpret the text. So it's almost like a religious, elite that is able to control the meaning of the text and to say what is correct and what is incorrect and what can and cannot be done. So this is, in general, we have kind of a reverence for law, and especially the common people who are not trained in legal language, and legal language is actively trying to be convoluted in a way, not to be really transparent to people, the same as sacred text were before in Latin, in order not to allow for the people to read for themselves and not have this approach to religion that is closer and you could interpret your own text. It's the same thing. In the US, in addition, we have an active sacralization of the text in a way that the Constitution, and specifically the Bill of Rights, an addendum to the Constitution, which was not part of it, as we know, right? It was added after, and James Madison was against actually having a Bill of Rights because he thought that they would be unenforceable. Doesn't matter. It's not, you can have the right to many things, but then the state is not really going to provide it, and you will not have enough, manpower to actually police that. And the courts are not going to be able to save you. So why have a Bill of Rights that will not be enforceable? However, then, because the Constitution was not going to be approved without a Bill of Rights, then it was added. But then the Bill of Rights became basically like the Ten Commandments. Anybody from any walk of life, they understand what is the First Amendment and the Second Amendment, and maybe not all the amendments, but basically there is a knowledge of the Constitution that is more profound and more emotional than any other people in the world that I have been in touch, in a way. Like, the people understand that constitutional law is something that they don't understand and it should be respected, but they don't have that emotional attachment with the text. I think that marks your identity and doesn't allow you to be critical to a text that you admire so much because it's sacred. You're not going to start editing the Bible, right? You're not going to start editing your text. Also, the sacralization of the founders, the idea that these were exceptional humans that were really selfless and perfect almost. Part of what we should do is actually contextualize them. And if the majority of the founders were moneylenders or speculators or planters, then you need to understand that that is their position in society. Today, it would be equivalent to having Wall Street people writing the Constitution for us, in a way. And this is, or the Elon Musks of the world, right? So that would not be legitimate. However, due to all these years, hundreds of years, 200 years and some, of a narrative from the state to sacralize that constitution and the narrative that comes along, it does not allow for the regular people to actually contest it. In addition, the third issue with this is that the rules for changing the Constitution, for calling a constituent assembly, for calling the people to interact and make decisions on what they want the rules in common to be, it's almost impossible to achieve. Because you have to have a majority, a great majority of the states in favor. You need to have in both houses of Congress. So all of the institutions that are representative, that is, that they have been elected through electoral means based on lobbyism and campaign finance and all this, corruption that we already know politicians are, the majority of them are tainted somehow, then you know that those institutions are really putting the brakes on change. They are blocking any kind of change that can come from below. Because if we get the people together to actually decide on the rules of the game, I can assure you that a wealth tax or a wealth cap or something like that will immediately become a law, and that a care for environment and, for the basically ripping off of the people by corporations will also be part of it. People are suffering, and in a way, the experience from that kind of suffering should be transformed into law, and that is what the elites want to prevent. So it makes it very difficult for people to actually do it through the rules, and extraordinarily difficult to do it against the rules or outside of the rules due to the massive structure of the United States, which is based on federalism, which, according to James Madison, was the first kind of valve, blocking basically the mass action by the popular classes to contest the power of elites.
Oh, I wasn't aware of that. Can you explain a little bit about that for the listeners here? I'd like to know more about that.
Yeah, so basically when James Madison was thinking about how are the mechanisms through which you would allow the people to vote and to be participating in a way, there was a real threat, or was perceived threat, that the majority of the people at some point will become dispossessed. You said that before the convention there was lots of equality around, between 70 and 75% of the population were yeoman farmers. So there was a lot of equality, way more than in Europe. But already with what I have already related about the Shays Rebellion, there was a lot of dispossession going on in real time at that time. So basically, they were very afraid of this. So one of the tasks was, how do we protect, basically, what the property that the elites have against the claims of that the dispossessed is if we have universal suffrage. Because if we have universal suffrage and the majority of people will be dispossessed, then the probability that those people will come together into one single party and basically take over is very high. So the best way of, not preventing this to happen is to break it apart, not allowing for the lower classes to band together and contest for power. And the first structural way to do this was to breaking apart the different states with different legislations and jurisdictions, making it very difficult for the working class of California to get together with the working class of New York in order to contest power.
Right, we can't overlook the malapportionment of the Senate, that every state has 2 senators, which is a highly undemocratic feature of the United States Constitution. So this is kind of what you're pointing to, is the structural deficits in the Constitution. You said there's a couple of different types of corruption, and you're focused on system corruption.
Systemic corruption basically is based on this ancient idea, that is so previous to the 18th century, where corruption became only individual. So before that, the ancients was always musing about, how everything that we create, either there is alive or non-alive, corrupts. So there's nothing that Plato would say famously, nothing that would withstand the time passing in a way. Things corrupt. So for the Greeks, the physical world and the artificial world that we create are not really very different. We create, they mimic each other. We create artificial things that also decay. And for them, for all the Greeks and the Romans, the systems that we create of law and political institutions are systems that we create, and therefore they tend to corrupt. So the more freedom that you have inside a constitution to basically push around the rules, the faster the kind of straitjacket that is limiting, individual ambition and greed basically will, become undone in a way. And that kind of corruption is not because of one person. It's not because of one party. It's because the people inside that are more powerful, relatively speaking, will be more ingenuous in a way to bypass the rules of the game and be kind of free of the straitjacket and make all the kind of limitations more to erode and be more porous in a way, until that structure will be so different from the original structure that it will mutate into another one. And for the Greeks, you had monarchy as the kind of good one-person leadership. So a monarch governs or rules for the common good, for the good of the people. A monarch can become a tyrant. So a corrupt monarchy becomes a tyranny, that basically it is one person rule, but basically for his own sake and his friends, not the common good. Then there's always an upheaval by the aristocracy. And aristocratic government means just the government of the best. And you can think about the best minds or the best leaders in society taking over and writing all the rules for us. And that could work for a while until, the second or third generation of these leaders that are not, really virtuous coming to being, and they just want to, have benefit for themselves. So you have an oligarchy, not the rule of the best, but the rule of the few for the benefit of the few, who are always the rich. And of course, that it degenerates so much until you have another upheaval that basically brings democracy back in a way, or at the end of the cycle, or back in, if you think that, of the origins of all time, there was always democracy, the government of the many, or the community self-government, right? And this community, in a way, according to different authors, was not a good thing. So for Plato, who was an aristocrat, democracy was inherently a corrupt form of government, because people believed that they were equal. So they were not taking care of the rules. So they were writing laws, and the examples are a little bit ridiculous, but they would say, well, and the women were all outside and talking and making their opinions heard, and the animals were not obeying the rules, and everything is a jungle, basically. This is like the idea of the anti-democrat about democracy. For Aristotle, a little bit different. Basically, democracy comes about when this equality is realized and everybody is taking part in government. And this also it is for him very dangerous because you don't have hierarchy. And people that are used to hierarchy and used to having an elite run things really are scared of, the people governing themselves. And this is something that was a very crucial for the ancients. So for them was obvious that all of the regimes that you could put in place, they will never last. They will always corrupt. So you need updates. You need renewal. So through, for example, Niccolo Machiavelli in the 16th century in Florence, he would say, well, we need constant renewal because there's no rules that will be so perfect that will be keeping contained basically the elite. So you need to, every once in a while, press the restart button, look at what laws are you missing, what people need to go to prison or be judged, and what kind of updates you need to do to the constitution as a kind of a technology of containing oligarchic power in a way. This was one of the visions of the democratic republic. And these ideas were lost during modernity. There was only one model, which was the liberal constitutionalism, was a neutral technology, if you will, that were going to preserve liberty for all and all these things that were sold basically in that time of the 18th century based on the idea of progress and benefits coming with it and basically no critical thinking about what are the conditions actually of the common people under those technologies of law.
There's a real tension between the elites and the, let's say, common people around the world. And I think part of that is because the people haven't really understood how to organize themselves peacefully and thoughtfully to deliberate over constitutional matters. Chile did this recently, and I want to get your thoughts on their effort to reform the Constitution. But it also occurs to me that there's been an apparent rise in the level of corruption in the United States, going back, we could say, back to Ronald Reagan or before. I don't want to be partisan here about this. What are your thoughts about the state of corruption in the United States these days, and what can we do about it?
Well, if you see corruption and the indexes of corruption, not only in the United States, but around the world, there is an overlap between the amount of corruption that is perceived and the amount of inequality that exists in the country. So to more inequality, there's more basically money to be bribing and to be, taking advantage of. So the individual corruption increases when you have structural corruption, in a way, in the sense that you have laws and tax legislations and regulations of all type that allow for the accumulation of wealth at levels that are exponential in a way. When you have those kinds of rules, those rules are not neutral. They are created and drafted through lobbyism from big corporations. So they basically are instruments of the oligarchy. So in a way, they're not neutral as we understand the rule of law we need to preserve. We don't, as moderns, we don't have not even a conception of a corrupt law. For us, law is not corrupt. It's almost like the opposite. But we need to understand that corruption is beyond the law. Actually, law can be corrupt if the law was basically created through, in a way, undue influence and is applied for the benefit of a few. We have, Citizens United and the campaign finance laws and Clinton, who actually legalized, lobbyism, right? So instead of getting rid of the lobbyists, who are the middle people between, interest groups and legislators, and they basically are paid for access, which is of course corrupt if you think about it, or to give money to candidates. This was of course corrupt and were illegal at the beginning of the 20th century. So they were illegal before. We couldn't deal with it, so we legalized them, and now they're part of the structure. So therefore, that allows for individual corruption to be rampant, and to start very in the 70s, mid 70s, after Reagan, as you well said, because Reagan basically is the corollary of Pinochet at the time. Thatcher and Reagan and Pinochet were in ruling Chile, the United States, and Britain at that time, and all shared information about how to apply neoliberal policies in order to allow for accumulation of wealth and this windfall of profits for the upper classes. This was part of the strategy of neoliberalism. So you have that kind of connection between individual corruption and systemic corruption, the corruption of the system as a whole, as democracy working for a few, not for the many, as it should. And that, of course, is paired with the lack of organization that you were saying before. There is, especially in the United States, in the non-indigenous communities, there is little tradition outside of the real activists in terms of how to make decisions collectively. We incorporate voting in every assembly. There's kind of individualism and leadership that stays in the way. There's a little solidarity or not a lot of history of solidarity outside of the more activist campaigns. The activists in the US are amazing. I have been in many of the kind of protests, and there's always lots of people putting their bodies on the line. So I really take my hat off for, the activists in the US. I was recently watching a documentary on Standing Rock. You see it almost only in the United States, in a way, people putting their bodily integrity for a cause that it doesn't even impact them directly, in a way. So this is remarkable. However, there is little of the history of organization. So going back to, the Chilean experiment on constitution making, there was Chile, again, also very neoliberal. All the kind of assembly-based structures were obliterated during the dictatorship. So people were even afraid to go vote, in a way. They don't want to be political. They don't want to even be involved, in a way. However, the situation was so bad with the neoliberal model that people went out to protest after, there was an increase in the metro fare, a little increase in the public transportation, and people just went out. And the media, as we know, is all also controlled by a big business. The media was not showing this, was showing only about some kind of conflict and violence on the side, but not really about the massive demonstrations. And social media played a big role in being the kind of counter-hegemonic form of media at that time. So the people started getting together for the first time with their neighbors, people that didn't even know their names, never had gone to an assembly, never had gone, no union, nothing whatsoever, even vote. After the crisis, they said, well, now is the time. And they just spontaneously said, okay, we're doing it. And people started gathering their neighborhoods and started, talking about what is to be a neoliberal subject in this world, in a way, that you think that everything is your fault, that you were, lay off from your work because you're not good enough, or because you were consuming too much and you were in debt. People have all kinds of stories, medical debt, all kinds of crises in their lives. But when they start talking, they understand that cannot be an individual failure, because everybody has these stories. It is a structural failure. So in that moment, the people say, well, we need to change the system. And if the system is the constitution, well, let's rewrite it. And there were at least 3,000 different assemblies, territorial, throughout Chile. We are 4,000 kilometers long. And people just started gathering from all walks of life, and they started drafting their own articles. And there was a whole pedagogy about how to do it, because if you go and read the Bill of Rights, or you go and read about the right to water or the right to housing in other constitutions in the world, you see that the phrasing of those rights is very simple. You don't need much. You don't need a kind of not even a high school education to actually draft some basic principles that then can be fleshed out by legislatures in a way. So people were empowered by, lawyers and activists that were teaching. Myself, I had a weekly YouTube constituent power and constituent process school, and basically just bringing down basically the high law into everyday life and teaching basically how to draft a constitution, do it yourself in a way. And people started doing it. And the government decided they were so threatened by this process that was happening on the outside, extra legally, that they didn't allow for these assemblies to actually participate formally in the process. They only allowed for individual petitions. So you had to basically have an idea or draft a mini article and then get, 20,000 signatures in order for you to pitch your article to the representative, the convention in a way. And this is during COVID. People couldn't do it. They had to do it in person. It was all very difficult for the people not to do it. However, they did it anyway. Thousands of people, just started drafting things and getting together in the weekends to do it. And many of those articles actually made it almost wholesale into the draft. So this was really a victory from below. And then the draft was defeated because basically of the rules of the game. The government didn't educate anyone about the Constitution. The far right took over the narrative, saying that the Constitution was even worse than the one that we had before. Forced around 40% of the people that didn't vote in the first round to go vote with high penalties if they didn't. So people that were not in the process, that were very conservative, and they didn't know, they didn't read the Constitution, they didn't do anything about it. They were basically the victims of advertisement and fake news. And the project was defeated, but not because it was a bad project, because basically it was a structural push to undermine what would have been the most progressive constitution in the world.
Shut down by a structural push. In this part of the interview, we traced corruption back to its roots, past the official, beyond the captured institutions, right down to the design of the very system we depend on to protect and serve us, our Constitution. Camila identified 3 types of corruption. Individual corruption, the garden variety quid pro quo corruption we're all familiar with. Institutional corruption, that is, the rampant fraud and abuse within our government agencies, exemplified by the VA, Housing and Urban Development, and the newly minted Department of War. Then there's the deepest, most insidious type, systemic corruption, woven into the very fabric of our Constitution. I keep coming back to this issue because so much of what we are all suffering from is, in my view, systemic. When government is captured by special interests, the people no longer have a voice. The government becomes an instrument of the minority to be used against the majority. Dr. Vergara makes the case that our Constitution was never the sacred document of liberty and justice we've all been conditioned to revere. It was instead a counter-revolution, drafted in the wake of Shays' rebellion to protect property, land, slave owners, and the accumulation of individual wealth. We should never forget the Constitution was intentionally designed to keep the dispossessed from ever banding together or from ever changing the rules of the game. Madison's federalism was designed to keep the working people of one state from joining hands with the working people of another. The malapportionment of the Senate gave more power to the less populous states, undermining the principle of equal representation. Article 5 froze the system in a block of ice, and running through it all is that long thread beginning with Plato, Aristotle, John Locke, Ronald Reagan, Margaret Thatcher, and Auguste Pinochet. Step by step, Camila demonstrated how a liberal democracy slides into oligarchy, which is exactly where we find ourselves today. As Bernie will remind you, The billionaires have never had it so good. This corruption happens with our consent. We allow it every time we look away from the system we have been taught to believe is perfect. We can end the corruption the moment we choose to organize to reclaim the Constitution for the people. After all, it does belong to all of us, not just a few. This brings us back to the recent events in Chile, where ordinary people did the very thing most Americans don't realize they have the power to do. They organized. They gathered in 3,000 neighborhood assemblies stretching across the country over 4,000 kilometers long, and they began to draft a constitution of their own. People who had never met each other, who had never joined a union, who had never voted in an election, came together, united in a common cause. And the result was a proposal for the most progressive constitution in the world. The tyranny of the minority is a familiar refrain. Many of you will instinctively understand what it means. Dr. Good describes what he calls the tripartite state behind the democratic government we think we live in. Behind the curtain is a national security state, and behind that an even deeper one still, an underworld of the corporate rich operating beyond the reach of the law. The curtain gets thinner every day, and the shadows of that deep state are now easier to recognize. Where Dr. Good shows how elite power overrides the rules, Dr. Vergara shows us how we, the people, can override the elites. When the few have enriched themselves at everyone else's expense, we have an obligation and a duty to act. And given the state of the world, we should all know it's time to restrain the power of this corrupt minority. The right to make and to alter our constitutions of government is an American innovation, and it is the surest safeguard of our liberty. This conversation is getting harder to ignore. When I started this podcast in 21, things were pretty bad. I wasn't especially hopeful. By most metrics, the world now is in worse shape than it was then, yet I am more optimistic than ever. The potential to build something that is genuinely more democratic, more inclusive for all, has never been greater. It comes down to making a choice, and that choice is a binary one. Do we want to live in a flawed and ineffective democracy? Or do the people of the United States truly believe that it is their right to live under a fully democratic and fully effective form of governance? One they created. This is the question before this generation, and we must all answer it soon. Change is coming either way. Watchdogs from the Brennan Center to the Brookings institutions warn that the old guardrails are coming off. A handful of mega-donors now control our elections, and the machinery built to restrain corruption is being dismantled before our eyes. Our elections are in serious trouble. The people's voice is being silenced. Camila's argument is uncomfortable but compelling. The corruption is no accident. This is not just another bad year for our politics. The system is doing exactly what it was designed to do, and it is becoming an existential threat to American democracy. In part 2 of Systemic Corruption, Camila and I will go deeper into what we can do as a nation to combat this corruption. We'll explore the Chilean uprising, the spark that led to a movement of movements, and the assemblies that took shape to produce the most progressive constitution in the world, and how the elites sabotaged it all. We'll look at corruption here in the United States and wrestle with the hardest question of all. If it's not the apple but the basket that is rotten, what do we build in its place? How do we organize to create a new paradigm for the United States? Is it time to toss out the bad apple? Or is it time to change the entire system that keeps producing them? Please stay tuned for part 2 of Systemic Corruption with Camila Vergara. This has been the Peaceful Political Revolution in America podcast. I'm John Molkins. Please remember, the revolution begins at home. So spread the word, and until then, stay safe out there.